Developer Warhorse Studio returns with Kingdom Come: Deliverance 2, the next chapter in its historical RPG built on CryEngine technology. This time around, we're looking at a purely current-gen release on Xbox Series X, Series S, PlayStation 5, and of course PS5 Pro. In putting the last-gen PS4 and Xbox One systems aside, the team is able to better focus its efforts on optimizing for a beautiful recreation of early 15th century Czech Republic on these four platforms, in each case realizing virtual acres of dense woodlands and bustling towns. Ahead of KCD2's release on the 4th of February then, I'm taking a preview look at how the four console versions stack up. How do their visuals compare? In particular, looking at the PS5 Pro upgrades next to base PS5. Also, do all platforms hold a rock-solid 60 frames per second in their performance modes where available? And finally, what's the state of the Xbox Series S version, where 30 FPS is the only option on offer? Let's find out. The ambition of KCD2 is unlike most games, and it's certainly unusual in the portfolio of CryEngine titles. Following directly on from the original, it once again puts us in the shoes of Henry, a former blacksmith apprentice who navigates the political turmoil across the Kingdom of Bohemia. Kicking off with an ill-fated mission to deliver a peace letter, you'll be faced with branching dialogue trees, during which the success of each interaction is often dictated by your stats. Stealth, combat, or the full charm offensive are all viable ways to push the story forward here. Also, en route, you'll be encouraged to play out the realities of 15th century living, including transporting sacks of food for coin, blacksmithing, and even brewing your own potions. The first-person dueling system returns as well, but the game as a whole doesn't really emphasize heavy action. There's a slower, more considered pace to KCD2 that pushes it more so into immersive sim territory than most RPGs going today. On a tech level, the highlights of the first Kingdom Come: Deliverance are only amplified in scale this time around. Above all else, the rendering of huge, dense woodland areas is the standout point, and from PS5 Pro to Xbox Series S, every console is able to realize these broad, sweeping landscapes backed by dynamic weather and time-of-day systems. It truly grounds the game in its historical premise and also the often methodical, sim-based nature of its gameplay. Grass and tree popping are in view, sadly, but what Warhorse Studio achieve on CryEngine takes on a suitably photorealistic look otherwise, largely thanks to the use of physically based materials. Everything from the metals on armor to the cloth on saddles reacts convincingly to the overcast midday lighting outdoors. And, meanwhile, the use of CryEngine's sparse voxel octree global illumination, or SVOGI, allows for convincing indirect light bounce, notably around interiors lit by torches. As an aside, you may notice some visual bugs in the footage here, like the occasional flickering material, and also this odd camera jitter while defending this turret with a crossbow. As ever though, these are points that may be addressed by the game's 4th of February release. Jumping to the comparisons, let's start with the basics first. In short, base PS5 and Series X offer two modes, a 30 frames per second Fidelity mode that renders at 1440p, and also a 60 FPS performance mode that renders at 1080p. Each one of these modes uses AMD's FSR technology to scale to a 4K or 1440p image respectively. Meanwhile, Xbox Series S runs at 1080p and 30 FPS out of the box with no alternative 60 FPS option available. And finally, PS5 Pro also removes the mode toggle in the menus, instead opting to offer a single way to play at 60 FPS, rendering internally at 1296p with a PSSR upscale to 4K. More on PS5 Pro in a second, but to address the mode differences on base PS5 and Series X, the Fidelity mode boosts foliage and shadow draw across terrain over the performance mode. Using base PS5 as an example here, outdoor scenes are more fully fleshed out on the 30 FPS Fidelity mode as a result, which also reduces the visibility of pop-in. Added to that, the Fidelity mode improves the quality of ambient occlusion, notably around interior details like these hanging plants, while you might also notice the object geometry setting is boosted as well. factoring in its superior image quality via a 1440p base resolution upscale to 4K, there's a trade-off to consider when using this 30fps mode on PS5 and Series X. So what is the PS5 Pro advantage? The good news is that all of these Fidelity Mode extras engage by default on Pro. We get improved tree and shadow LEDs this way, ambient occlusion, and object quality. And the crucial bit is it all runs at 60fps rather than 30. Essentially, this lives up to Mark Cerny's original pitch for the PS5 Pro in removing the burden of choice between two modes to instead give one singular option that does it all. Compared to base PS5's own performance mode, PS5 Pro's use of PSSR, using 1296p as a base, also boosts image quality all round. The result is sharper, often better defining the fine detail on distant grass ahead, or even, for example, the individual strands of a horse's mane. Even compared to base PS5's Fidelity mode, it holds up well. The only catch being that there is a slight increase in temporal flicker compared to the base PS5's FSR approach. Otherwise, the move to the more expensive PSSR method pays off in generating a 4K image, while also keeping 60fps and all those Fidelity mode extras in view. A final word on the Xbox machines. Xbox Series S only runs at 30fps of course, and at a native 1080p that does not rely on any variation of FSR to upscale it. In effect, this means the game renders at 1080p on Series S with a conventional upscale if you're outputting to a 4K display. It is disappointing, and the result is blurrier than, for example, the 1080p 60fps performance modes on PS5 and Series X. And certainly a step down next to their 1440p 30fps Fidelity modes in clarity. A few other downgrades bear mention too. Firstly, Series S runs with lower quality shadows, while textures take a hit in quality up close as well. Likewise, alpha effects for fire, for example, drop a setting while in outdoor scenes, while there's more abundant tree and shadow pop-in on the 4 teraflop machine. By comparison, the PS5 and Series X Fidelity modes aren't problem-free, and all three share a similar 15fps refresh on shadows past a certain range, notably beneath the horses ahead of the player on this early route to Trotsky Castle. Also, Series X's Fidelity mode suffers from what appears to be a settings bug, causing some foliage elements to run at a draw distance setting below PS5 and even Series S. This will ideally be addressed by release, but fundamentally, the Series S version has the deepest cutbacks in its shadows, textures, and pop-in. Switching to framerate testing, PS5 and Xbox Series X's performance modes each hit the target 60fps a majority of the time. It's not a faultless delivery, but the drop to 1080p for this mode does pay off in a convincingly robust experience. It's good news too that PS5 Pro hands in a broadly equivalent experience in hitting that 60fps line on its default mode, while an early Castle Siege battle also runs with only the briefest of blips on Series X here. Later stress points, however, do reveal Series X suffering the greater and more consistent drops under 60 by comparison. An early stealth segment in the swamps, for example, has Series X drop into the 50 to 60fps range, while base PS5 and PS5 Pro tend to keep their heads above water at 60. Perhaps more tellingly, a dream sequence puts all three consoles through their paces, where again, Series X takes the biggest drops to the 50fps line. Base PS5, by comparison, comes out with the smoother, closer lock at 60, while PS5 Pro falls in between the two. It's worth mentioning adaptive VSync is used on all three consoles, causing an occasional flash of screen tearing right at the top of the display, which is factored into the frame rate reading here. As a curious twist, those playing on 120Hz displays with VRR enabled have access to an entirely unlocked frame rate in KCD2. This, in effect, allows us to better split the three in terms of performance, where the 60fps cap would hide the differential otherwise. It also, however, does mean in this case we need to use camera footage of my display's framerate overlay, so apologies for the drop in image quality here. It's a crude example, but it does at least prove the point. Once again, base PS5 produces the best framerate overall, with a margin of plus 5 to 8 FPS over the PS5 Pro in matching scenes, which in itself hovers at around the same as Series X. This base PS5 advantage over Pro hardware might seem surprising on first glance, but it's not a precise match in rendering load between them. The newer PS5 model is, after all, pushing equivalent to the Fidelity mode settings, while crucially also deploying the more expensive PSSR upscaling to 4K. In the end, PS5 Pro users are still getting a reasonable balance between visuals and framerate here, and especially so if you're able to use VRR. The easy recommendation is to use the 60fps performance mode, though the 30fps fidelity mode is a welcome extra option. PS5 hits the 30fps line with little issue this way, giving us a stable line despite the jump to 1440p and adding those boosted settings. The biggest drawback, perhaps, is the loss in input responsiveness here, with an obvious delay in every action while running at 30fps. As far as PS5 is concerned otherwise, it is stable and once again, often more so than the Xbox consoles. By comparison, and switching to Series X, we're often running at a perfect 30fps, though there are instances, like this early spot while foraging for herbs, where it does lurch into the mid-20s. It's another sign that Series X is currently lagging behind in optimization, but again, most of play hits the mark. The Xbox Series S version, meanwhile, follows a similar pattern, though is slightly more prone to drops to the mid-20s. Typically, it still holds at 30 a majority of the time, but the regularity of drops when facing dense woodland spots is higher. It's a shame given the cutbacks elsewhere on Series S, and that there's no alternative mode to switch to improve matters. Seven years on since the original game, Kingdom Come Deliverance 2's ambition fits the capabilities of each modern console well. Perhaps its greatest success is in offering a viable 60 frames per second option on PS5, PS5 Pro and Series X, while also letting us go above that on supporting VRR displays. It's also heartening to see that PS5 Pro's extra horsepower, plus PSSR upscaling technology, are well utilized in this case. The result for Pro users is a smart fusion of PS5's performance and fidelity modes, combining 60fps gameplay and higher visual settings in one mode. On the flip side, Xbox Series S is facing more obvious cutbacks, with the fixed 30fps, the limited 1080p upscale, and the dropped visual settings are a disappointment. In the run-up to the game's 4th of February release, it's the platform where I'm hoping to see the most improvement, whereas the other three consoles hand in a much more worthy take on Warhorse Studio's long-gestating sequel. But that's all from me today. If you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video and many more, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.